There are truths that only become visible with time. When we are young, we believe life owes us some kind of revelation, some kind of recognition, some unique place in the world. But as the years go by, with their relentless sobriety, they strip away one illusion after another, until all that remains is the essential question: what if there was never anything extraordinary waiting for us? This is one of the most uncomfortable and also one of the most freeing insights of existentialism. The idea that existence does not come to human beings with purpose, central importance, or cosmic significance attached to it. We are not the highest point of some greater story. There are no guarantees of meaning. There is no promise that life will reward those who endured the most. And even so, there is something deeply dignified about this condition. In this video, we are going to explore the cruel philosophy of existentialism, not as a doctrine of despair, but as a rare invitation to lucidity. Because maybe maturity begins exactly when we stop asking why we were not chosen, and start facing with courage what it really means to simply exist. There comes a point in life when almost everyone realizes, even without knowing how to put it into words, that the world does not revolve around them. This realization usually does not arrive as a calm idea. It arrives as a wound, not only because it corrects a childish illusion, but because it strikes something deeper, the secret desire to be necessary, central, chosen. Freud helps explain this blow when he talks about humanity's narcissistic wounds. In his lectures and writings on the history of thought, he suggests that human beings have suffered at least 3 humiliations to their pride. First, through Copernicus, when it was discovered that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Then through Darwin, who showed that we are not separate from the rest of life, but part of animal evolution. And finally through psychoanalysis itself, which revealed that consciousness does not fully rule over itself. The self, which once imagined itself as king, discovers that it sits on no throne, not in the cosmos, not in nature, and not even within itself. It is hard to exaggerate the weight of this realization. Human narcissism is not just shallow vanity. It is an existential need to feel like we are more than something contingent. Human beings want to believe that their pain holds a special place in the universe, that their desires carry unique meaning, that their presence changes the course of things in some decisive way. When that fantasy starts to fall apart, what appears is not just humility. Very often, what appears is rebellion. The soul resists. It would rather invent signs of greatness than accept its true scale. Freud saw this clearly. We do not easily accept the idea that we are driven by obscure forces, fragile in the face of reality, limited in knowledge, power, and control. There is something in us that insists on returning to the center, even after being expelled from it. This is exactly where Blaise Pascal, in Pensées, becomes such a powerful voice. Pascal does not treat the human being as pure greatness or pure misery. He insists on this uncomfortable contradiction. Man is, at the same time, miserable and great. Miserable because he is fragile, finite, deceived by himself, vulnerable to time, suffering, and death. Great because he knows it. In one of his most famous lines, he calls the human being a reed, the weakest in nature, but adds that he is a thinking reed. The image is devastating and beautiful at the same time. A reed can be crushed by a drop of water, by a gust of wind, by the smallest accident. But that same reed knows that it will die. And in that, for Pascal, lies a unique dignity, the awareness of one's own condition. This tension matters because it helps us avoid 2 opposite mistakes. The first is delusions of grandeur, believing that we are the center of the world, the favorites of the universe, beings whose existence already comes loaded with objective importance. The second is simplistic nihilism, concluding that because we are not central, we are worth nothing. Pascal accepts neither of these easy escapes. For him, human greatness does not lie in ruling the cosmos, but in being able to think about our own fragility. Man is small before the infinite, but it is precisely because he can contemplate the infinite that he rises above brute matter. His dignity does not come from being the center, but from being aware of his own decentering. This point feels deeply relevant today. One of the greatest struggles of the modern person is accepting that value is not the same thing as centrality. Many people confuse being important with being the focus. They confuse dignity with visibility. They confuse depth with being exceptional. That is why the narcissistic wound hurts so much. It does not just destroy pride, it strikes at the very way a person has learned to measure themselves. If I am not indispensable, does that mean I am disposable? If I am not extraordinary, does that mean I am insignificant? Freud shows why this reaction is so intense. The ego is constantly trying to protect itself from anything that reduces its sense of sovereignty. Pascal, in turn, shows that maybe the real problem is wanting a sovereignty that was never ours to begin with. There is even a kind of freedom in this fall, although it usually comes late and rarely without pain. When a human being stops demanding that the universe confirm their importance, they begin to see the truth with less drama. Life loses one kind of fantasy, but gains a deeper weight. It is no longer necessary to keep up the fiction of being the center in order to recognize that human experience is still serious, tragic, and valuable. The fact that the cosmos does not owe us attention does not make pain, love, fear, thought, or moral choice any less real. The narcissistic wound, when it matures, can produce not sterile humiliation, but lucidity. Pascal understood something that modern sensitivity often forgets. Human beings lose themselves, both when they glorify themselves too much and when they despise themselves too much. Those who see only greatness fall into illusion. Those who see only misery fall into despair. The truth, for him, is harder because it is double. We are fragile, but conscious. Ridiculous in our pretensions, yet admirable in our ability to recognize that very fragility. It is a severe view, but also a deeply human one. It does not flatter human beings, but it does not erase them either. Maybe that is why this lesson is still so necessary. The shock of not being the center of the world does not have to be read as a sentence of condemnation. It can be read as a moral and spiritual correction. Freud exposes the wound. Pascal teaches us how to bear it without lying to ourselves. Between wounded vanity and hard-earned lucidity, the human being discovers an uncomfortable truth. He is not the center of the universe, but he is the being capable of understanding what it means not to be. And maybe that awareness, painful as it is already a more honest form of greatness. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky creates one of the most uncomfortable figures in literature, precisely because he destroys a fantasy that many people quietly carry inside themselves. The belief that, deep down, they are meant for some kind of greatness. The underground man is not a hero, not admirable, not strong, not spiritually elevated. He is too lucid to fully deceive himself, but too weak to turn that lucidity into action. And it is from this poisonous combination that his resentment is born. His pain does not come only from outward suffering. It comes mainly from realizing that he is ordinary, powerless, ridiculous, and unable to maintain, even in his own eyes, the image of someone exceptional. That is what makes the book feel so modern. The underground man does not suffer only because the world is unfair. He suffers because he cannot accept his own lack of greatness. There is something in him that wants to be noticed, respected, superior, important. But all he finds within himself is hesitation, wounded vanity, self-contempt, and the desire to humiliate others before being humiliated himself. He cannot bear being just another person, but he also cannot become what he believes he deserves to be. And this gap between the idealized self and the real self produces bitterness. Dostoevsky understands deeply a human mechanism that is still very much alive. When a person cannot bear their own mediocrity, they rarely respond with calm acceptance. Instead, they rationalize, mock, sabotage, despise, and accuse. The underground man does this constantly. He turns his passivity into supposed intellectual superiority. Since he does not act, he convinces himself that action is vulgar. Since he does not belong, he convinces himself that everyone else is stupid. Since he fails, he tries to turn failure into proof of refined consciousness. This is his moral misery. He would rather poison the value of the world than admit his own smallness within it. That is why Notes from Underground is more than just the portrait of a disturbed individual. It is an anatomy of resentment. A resentful person is not simply someone who has been hurt. It is someone who turns the wound into an identity. Instead of recognizing the pain and moving through it, they begin to organize their whole life around it. The underground man almost seems to need humiliation, because without it, he would lose the inner script that justifies his bitterness. He revisits old offenses, imagines revenge, rehearses scenes of greatness that never actually happen. He lives less in reality than in the mental theater of wounded pride. There is an especially important element in this: his obsession with being recognized by those who ignore him. He wants to enter the other person's field of vision, not out of genuine affection, but out of vanity. He wants to prove that he exists, that he matters, that his presence has weight. But his attempts are always awkward, late, excessive. He enters human relationships already poisoned by comparison. He does not meet people. He meets mirrors. And in every mirror, he looks for proof that he is worth more than he fears he is. Since that proof never comes in a way that satisfies him, he becomes more and more hostile. What is most cruel is that the underground man knows all of this. He is not some innocent fool. He sees the pettiness of his own impulses, recognizes his own theatrical behavior, understands his own cowardice. But this awareness does not save him. In some moments, it drives him even deeper into the abyss. Dostoevsky seems to be saying that seeing yourself clearly is not enough when you lack the inner strength to change. Self-awareness, without moral transformation, can become just another tool of torture. The underground man constantly analyzes himself, but he never rebuilds himself. He tears illusions apart, but remains enslaved by them. This is exactly where he embodies modern bitterness in the face of mediocrity, because modern life feeds people with promises of uniqueness. In countless ways, it tells them that their life should be special, memorable, brilliant. When that expectation meets ordinary reality limits, anonymity, failure, daily banality, the shock can become unbearable. The underground man represents the collision even before contemporary culture turned it into a mass experience. He is the person who refuses to accept being ordinary, but also cannot find within himself the discipline, courage, or simplicity needed to live with dignity without needing grandeur. His tragedy is not that he is mediocre. Almost all human beings, in one way or another, are ordinary. The tragedy is turning that into a metaphysical insult. It is living as if the world had denied him some higher destiny that he was owed. Resentment is born exactly when a person interprets their own limitations, not as part of the human condition, but as a personal injustice. The underground man does not suffer only because he is small. He suffers because he believes he should not be. And since he cannot truly rise, he tries to pull everything around him down. This dynamic appears strongly in his relationship with action. He despises the man of action because, deep down, he envies him. To him, action always seems simplistic, crude, naive. Thinking too much becomes an excuse not to live. Overanalyzing becomes protection against the risk of concrete failure. In this way, his intelligence turns into paralysis. He clings to his exaggerated self-consciousness as if it were proof of superiority, when in reality it functions as a mask for incapacity. Dostoevsky is merciless in this portrait. lucidity can become a sophisticated form of cowardice. That is also why the book is so disturbing. It forces the reader to admit that resentment does not always come from external oppression. Sometimes it comes from wounded pride in the face of one's own insufficiency. Not every form of revolt is noble. Not every pain produces depth. There is a kind of suffering that rots because it refuses to mature. The underground man is the image of that inner decay, someone who prefers the bitterness of humiliated consciousness to the hard work of transformation. Dostoevsky offers no comfort here. He shows that there is something degrading about turning your own frustration into an altar. And maybe that is the great philosophical force of Notes from Underground. It reveals that the greatest enemy of the ordinary person is not being ordinary, but finding that condition unbearable. When someone believes they would only have value if they were extraordinary, they begin to hate everything that reminds them of their real size. The underground man lives like this, trapped between the desire to be unique and the cruel evidence that he is not. His resentment is born from that wound, and so is his ruin. One of Jean-Paul Sartre's most uncomfortable ideas is also one of his most freeing. Human beings are not born with a ready-made essence. In Existentialism is a humanism. He expresses this in a famous way by saying that for man, existence precedes essence. This means that no one comes into the world with a predefined meaning, a fixed nature, or a guaranteed metaphysical mission. First, we exist. Only afterward, through our choices, do we become something. At first glance, this may sound like a celebration of freedom, and in fact, it is. But in Sartre, this freedom comes inseparably tied to a brutal weight. Because if there is no pre-made essence, then there is no final excuse either. In that sense, not being special is not just about losing the privilege of being the center of the world. It is about discovering that there is no invisible mold that explains who you are. This is the existential wound that replaces the comfort of cosmic importance. Many people can handle the idea of being small in an ordered universe better than they can handle the idea of being free in a universe without guarantees. It is less distressing to believe that there is a role reserved for us, even a modest one, than to admit that nothing was reserved for us at all. Sartre tears down that hope. In Being in Nothingness, he shows that human consciousness is not a finished, stable, substantial thing. A human being is not like an object that has a determined function from the moment it is made. A knife is made to cut. Its essence comes before its existence. But a human being is not like that. He appears in the world and finds before him the task of inventing himself. That does not make him naturally glorious. On the contrary, it exposes him to abandonment. That is why Sartre says, "We are condemned to be free." The phrase is harsh because it rejects any easy romanticizing. This is not a light, inspiring, almost decorative kind of freedom. It is unavoidable freedom. Even when we try to escape it, we are already exercising it. Even when we obey, we are choosing to obey. Even when we hide behind social roles, trauma, customs, or commandments, we are still responsible for the way we take all of that on. The condemnation lies precisely in the fact that we cannot stop choosing. And that total responsibility destroys a very human fantasy, the idea that somewhere there is a secret essence capable of excusing us. At this point, the idea of not being special takes on a deeper meaning. Usually, people associate being special with having rare talents, recognition, or social importance. Sartre goes deeper than all of that. You are not special because you did not come into the world with a metaphysical stamp. There is no sacred substance in you, no transcendent script, no final identity waiting to be discovered intact. What exists is openness, project, indeterminacy. That may sound disappointing to someone who wants to feel chosen, but Sartre wants to show that this absence of essence is not some accidental lowering of human worth. It is the human condition itself. Man does not have a guaranteed place in the cosmos. He only has the endless task of making something of himself. But that task is exhausting and often terrifying, because if there is no fixed nature, there is no safe shelter either. The comfort of cosmic importance came from imagining that our life was already written into some greater order. Sartre removes that comfort and replaces it with a radical demand. You are what you do, not what you dream of being, not what you say you are, not what you could have been under different circumstances. In existential terms, a human being is defined by his actions. That is why freedom feels so heavy. It is not just power. It is exposure. It is not just possibility. It is risk. Every choice draws a shape of being, and there is no prior essence that comes to protect us from the consequences. In existentialism is a humanism. Sartre insists that when a person chooses for himself, he is also proposing an image of what it means to be human. This makes the weight of freedom even greater. We do not decide in a vacuum. Our choices affirm values. When I act cowardly, I do not just make myself a coward. I also confirm cowardice as a human possibility that can be embraced. When I act courageously, I also affirm a way of being human. This view removes the comfort of thinking that our private decisions are too small to matter. The universe may not grant us central importance, but our freedom still has moral weight. We are not special by essence. We are responsible by construction. This responsibility, however, awakens what Sartre calls anguish. Anguish is not simple fear. It is the vertigo of realizing that nothing outside of us can decide in our place in any final way. Even following a rule is a choice. Even obeying a tradition assumes that we have given it authority. This strips the person of any innocence. I can no longer honestly say, "I'm like this because I was born for it," or "I had no alternative," as if I were just a passive part of some mechanism. Sartre knows that social, historical, and psychological conditions exist, but he refuses to turn them into absolute alibis. Freedom remains, even when it is situated, pressured, and limited. And that is exactly why it hurts, because it never completely disappears. Human beings try to escape this burden through bad faith, a central concept in being and nothingness. Bad faith is the attempt to lie to yourself by pretending that you are a fixed thing, or that you are not responsible for your own life project. It is the waiter who reduces himself entirely to the role of waiter, as if his identity were the same as his function. It is the person who says, "That's just the way I am," as if character were a natural prison rather than a history of repeated choices. It is also the person who hides behind the idea of destiny, an unchangeable personality, or a mission given from the outside in order to avoid the burden of deciding. Bad faith is seductive because it gives back the lost comfort. It makes life seem as if it came already written. But for Sartre, that comfort is false. That is why his philosophy is so harsh and so honest. It does not allow man to make up for his lack of centrality with some hidden essential nobility. If the universe does not owe you importance, it does not owe you identity either. You are not special in the sense of carrying some higher essence. You are free in the most unsettling sense. You must create value without guarantees. The greatness that remains possible is not found in receiving meaning, but in taking it on without any protective authority above you. And that movement is more austere than comforting. At its core, Sartre forces the individual to grow up philosophically. Losing the fantasy of cosmic importance is already hard. Losing the fantasy of a ready-made essence is even more radical. But maybe there is a less narcissistic dignity in that. Not the dignity of someone who was chosen, but of someone who answers for himself. Not the dignity of someone who stands at the center, but of someone who carries the weight of choice in a world with no script. In Sartre, freedom does not comfort. It weighs on us, unsettles us, and accuses us. But it is precisely in that weight that man stops waiting for a given meaning and begins, without guarantees, to become the author of his own existence. In Meditations, Marcus Aurelius returns again and again to an idea that wounds pride, but at the same time purifies the soul. Every human being is only a small part of an immense whole. We are not the axis of the universe. We are not the secret destiny of creation, and we are not the absolute measure of all things. We are passing fragments within an order far greater than our desires, fears, and ambitions. To the modern mind, which is used to inflating the self, this may sound harsh. But for the Stoics, this perception is not meant to humiliate human beings. It is meant to heal them of vanity. Cosmic humility does not destroy human value. It simply puts it back in its proper place. Marcus Aurelius writes as someone surrounded by power, and for that very reason, aware of the illusion that power creates. As Emperor of Rome, he had every reason to imagine himself as central. And yet, instead of turning his position into proof of metaphysical greatness, he constantly reminds himself of the fragility of everything: fame, glory, the body, public opinion, historical memory. In Meditations, he reflects on how all those who were praised before him disappeared, just as those who praised them also disappeared. The most celebrated name is swallowed up by the same flow of time that swallows the most anonymous one. This awareness does not lead him into cynicism, but into radical sobriety. In the face of the vastness of time and nature, a person learns that their personal drama, while real, is not the center of existence. This is one of the great lessons of Stoicism. Vanity is born when we confuse our own perspective with the structure of the world. We suffer more than necessary because we treat our immediate interests as if they were absolute. We want events to obey our desires. We want other people to confirm our importance. We want time to preserve our image. We want reality to organize itself around our preferences. Marcus Aurelius fights exactly this delusion. For him, living well begins when a person recognizes that they belong to the cosmos, not the other way around. It is not the universe that must adjust itself to the ego. It is the ego that must learn to live within a greater order. But this awareness of smallness does not mean that human life is worth nothing. That is a crucial point. Stoicism does not reduce man to meaningless dust in a nihilistic sense. It does not say, "You are small, therefore you are irrelevant." It says something more demanding and more noble. You are small, so stop worshiping yourself and do your part well. For Marcus Aurelius, human value does not depend on standing at the center of the cosmos, but on living in agreement with reason, justice, inner discipline, and shared human nature. Human dignity lies less in being grand than in acting rightly within the limits that belong to us. This shift in focus is deeply freeing. When a person believes they must be extraordinary in order to have value, they sentence themselves to endless restlessness. They begin measuring their life through comparison, recognition, superiority, and permanence. Everything becomes proof of identity. Everything becomes a courtroom. Cosmic humility breaks that fever. If I am only a tiny part of the whole, then I do not need to turn every frustration into a metaphysical tragedy. I do not need to demand constant validation of my ego from life. I can focus my strength on what actually depends on me: my judgment, my character, my conduct. Marcus Aurelius insists on this point again and again. There is a difference between what is under our control and what is not. This distinction, inherited from the Stoic tradition, especially from Epictetus, is central to understanding his calmness. The body ages, reputation rises and falls, the empire shakes, people make mistakes, death arrives. None of this can be completely avoided. What remains as the truly human task is the way we respond to these conditions. In this way, awareness of the vastness of the cosmos does not paralyze, it refines. It takes away from man the fantasy of total control and returns him to the only sovereignty truly possible, sovereignty over himself. In Meditations, there is also a recurring exercise in perspective. Marcus Aurelius advises looking at events from above, as if the mind could observe the movement of cities, crowds, wars, business, births, and deaths all at once in one vast panorama. This view from above has a moral purpose. It reduces the emotional inflation created by the ego. What looks enormous up close reveals its true scale from a distance. The offense that seemed unforgivable, the praise that seemed decisive, the ambition that seemed absolute, all of this changes size when placed within the totality of time and nature. Not because it stops existing, but because it stops seeming like the center of everything. This practice is especially important in a world where the individual is constantly encouraged to overestimate themselves. Contemporary culture teaches that every feeling should be amplified, every desire should be treated like destiny, every identity should be celebrated as if it were the center of the universe. Marcus Aurelius moves in the opposite direction. He invites the individual to lower their inner fever in order to rediscover order. This is not self-hatred, but proportion. The self stops being an idol and becomes a part again. And paradoxically, only then can it live with greater balance. Another important point is that, for the Stoics, being part of the cosmos also means being part of a rational community. A human being is valuable not because they are exceptional, but because they share with others the capacities for reason and social life. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself that we are made to cooperate, like feet, hands, eyelids, and teeth. This image is powerful because it moves value away from greatness and toward rightful function. The question is no longer, how can I be admired? But how can I act in a way that fits my rational nature and the common good? Vanity isolates. Cosmic humility places the individual back inside a larger order, both natural and human. At the deepest level, what Marcus Aurelius offers is a spiritual correction of the imagination. He knows that the human ego becomes sick when it treats itself as absolute. He also knows that healing does not come from inflating it even more, but from teaching it to occupy its true place. We are small, yes. Temporary, yes. Easily forgotten, yes. But that does not necessarily lower us. It simply forces us to abandon the theater of self-importance. And once freed from that vanity, we can live with greater sobriety, greater justice, and greater peace. The great lesson of Meditations is that human smallness does not erase dignity. It purifies it. A person does not need to be the center of the cosmos in order to live nobly. They only need to understand that they are part of a greater order, and within it, do their role well. In Marcus Aurelius, cosmic humility is not humiliation. It is lucidity. And maybe one of the most mature forms of freedom is exactly this, accepting that we are tiny in the universe without. Because of that, refusing to take responsibility for the greatness of our character. In the world as will and representation, Schopenhauer offers one of the harshest and most disillusioning views of existence. For him, behind all the civilized, rational, and elevated appearances of human life, there is a more primitive and relentless force, the will. This will is not a conscious plan, a moral ideal, or a noble destiny. It is a blind drive to want, to seek, to grasp, to continue. Everything lives because it wants, but almost nothing truly knows why it wants. And that is exactly where the cruelty of his philosophy begins. Living is not about fulfilling some glorious essence, but about moving endlessly between lack, effort, brief satisfaction, and new lack. You are not special in this process. You are just one more expression of this universal mechanism of need. Schopenhauer tears apart the flattering image human beings have of themselves. We like to believe that our desires are deep, unique, and full of personal meaning. We imagine that our suffering has some exceptional dignity, that our ambitions say something grand about who we are. But for him, this is mostly an illusion. What we call personality, life purpose, or the search for happiness is often nothing more than refined versions of a more basic dynamic, wanting something because something is missing. Human beings do not escape this law just because they are intelligent. In fact, their intelligence often only makes the prison more sophisticated. They do not stop desiring. They simply come up with more elaborate justifications for their desires. This is one of Schopenhauer's central ideas. Desire does not bring peace. It brings movement. As long as we desire, we suffer from the absence of what we want. When we finally get the object of our desire, the suffering does not disappear in any lasting way. It simply changes form. Then boredom appears, or saturation, or indifference, or else a new desire takes the place of the old one. Life, then, moves back and forth between pain and boredom. Pain, when something is missing. Boredom, when nothing is immediately missing. This description may seem exaggerated, but it is disturbing precisely because it touches something so recognizable. How many times has a goal seemed full of absolute promise while it was still far away, only to lose its shine quickly once it was achieved? How many times has the mind turned one accomplishment into the starting point for another form of restlessness? Schopenhauer would say, this is not an accident, it is structure. That is why his philosophy strikes directly at human vanity. Vanity depends on the belief that we are more than we really are, that we hold some unique position, that our dramas are extraordinary. But under Schopenhauer's gaze, the individual discovers something humiliating. He is not some shining center of meaning, but an organism crossed by impulses, needs, and repetitions. His pride suffers because it wants to imagine an exception where there is only a rule. It wants to see destiny where there is only mechanism. It wants to call greatness what is often just hunger dressed in refined language. Schopenhauer is merciless on this point because he sees suffering as a condition, not as a deviation. Most philosophies and religions, in one way or another, try to place suffering inside some redemptive frame. It teaches, strengthens, purifies, leads to something higher. In Schopenhauer, that hope becomes much weaker. We suffer because to desire is to suffer, and desiring is inseparable from being alive. Suffering is not an occasional flaw in the system. It is the very logic of the will at work. This does not mean that every human experience is nonstop misery, but it does mean that pain is rooted more deeply in existence than our vanity likes to admit. And maybe this is the most uncomfortable point. Insignificance is not just that we are small in the cosmos, but that we are predictable in our structure. We want, we struggle, we get frustrated, we achieve, we grow tired, we begin again. The names change, the settings change, the objects of desire change, but the circuit remains. What one person loves is different from what another person loves. What one person wants is not what another wants. And yet, beneath those biographical differences, the same machinery is there. Schopenhauer looks at this repetition and refuses to call it a sublime drama. For him, it is more like an ontological captivity. And human beings, no matter how vain they are not essentially different from other beings because they rise above this, but only because they can perceive their own captivity with more clarity. That awareness, however, does not bring automatic comfort. Knowing that you are trapped in the will does not dissolve the will. The individual keeps desiring, even when he understands the insatiable nature of desire. He keeps chasing recognition, pleasure, security, love, power, distraction. And here vanity becomes even more tragic. It is an attempt to decorate lack. A person wants to be admired, not only because of social need, but because admiration works as a temporary anesthetic against the feeling of insufficiency. They want to stand out because they imagine that being exceptional might redeem them from the ordinary condition. But according to Schopenhauer, this is self-deception. Applause does not change the structure of existence. Success does not cancel the will. Social uniqueness frees no one from the wheel of wanting. That is why his philosophy can sound cruel, but also strangely honest. It takes away from human beings the fantasy that their life is naturally special just because it is theirs. The fact that you feel your pain intensely does not make it a cosmic exception. The fact that your desires seem central to you does not make them metaphysically privileged. You suffer the way others suffer. You want the way others want. You get frustrated the way countless beings get frustrated. There is something deeply anti-narcissistic in this view. It tears down the theater of self-importance and places the person in front of a rough truth. Your inner life, no matter how complex it may be, still takes part in a universal logic of need. But Schopenhauer does not stop at demolition. Even though his vision is dark, he points to small openings of relief. Aesthetic contemplation, for example, temporarily suspends the rule of the will. In art, the individual stops desiring for a moment and simply contemplates. In compassion, he breaks the illusion of absolute separation and recognizes in another person's suffering the same structure that runs through himself. And in its most radical form, the denial of the will represents an attempt to renounce the endless cycle of wanting. These paths do not erase his basic pessimism, but they show that Schopenhauer is not only interested in humiliating man. He wants to free him from the lie that full satisfaction will come if he just keeps pushing a little harder in the same game. Schopenhauer confronts vanity where it hides best, in the belief that our suffering makes us special. Schopenhauer answers, no, it only makes us alive. To live is to desire is to lack is to suffer, and to suffer is to repeat a structure that did not begin with us and will not end with us. This wounds the ego, no doubt, but it can also produce a rare kind of lucidity. When the individual stops imagining himself as some glorious exception, maybe he can begin to look at himself with less illusion. And in that more sober gaze, painful as it may be, there is a severe kind of truth. You are not special because you suffer. You are human because you suffer. In Pensées, Blaise Pascal is one of the most powerful images of the human condition. Man is only a reed, the weakest in nature, but he is a thinking reed. In that single sentence, almost all of his spiritual view of humanity is already there. The human being is fragile, exposed, vulnerable, easily destroyed by forces much smaller than he likes to imagine he controls. And at the same time, he is gifted with thought, consciousness, and reflective inner life. He knows that he suffers, knows that he dies, knows that he is small. It is exactly this contradiction that makes human existence so unsettling. Man wants greatness, reaches for the absolute, dreams of permanence, yet lives suspended between nothingness and infinity, unable to settle fully into either one. Pascal writes against two illusions. The first is the triumphalist illusion, according to which man is naturally great, self-sufficient, almost divine because of his reason. The second is the cynical illusion, according to which man is nothing but misery, worthless matter, an accident without dignity. For Pascal, neither of these images by itself is true. The human being is great and miserable at the same time. Great because he thinks, because he judges, because he searches for truth, because he is capable of recognizing his own condition. Miserable because his body is weak, his knowledge is limited, his will is unstable, and his life is brief. The truth about the human being lies in this tension, and that is exactly why he never finds easy rest within himself. The image of the reed is decisive because it pulls us out of the delusion of centrality. A reed is something tiny, bendable, almost insignificant in the face of the violence of nature. A gust of wind can bend it. A drop of water, a fever, an accident, a failure of the body can bring a human being down. Pascal wants to remind us that all our vanity rests on an extremely fragile foundation. Man builds empires, writes systems, invents glories, plans futures, yet remains subject to exhaustion, illness, chance, and death. It takes very little to interrupt everything he calls destiny. And yet Pascal does not use this fragility to humiliate man down into the dust. On the contrary, it is precisely because man knows he is fragile that he becomes greater than what destroys him. The universe may crush him physically, but it does not know that it crushes him. Man does, and in that awareness lies his dignity. An immense cosmos has no consciousness of itself. A star does not reflect on its own existence. An ocean does not know its own vastness. Man, although infinitely smaller than these realities in size and force, has the ability to think. He can understand his own smallness. He can look at the infinite and realize that he cannot contain it. He can face nothingness and tremble before it. That is what makes him singular, not as the center of the world, but as a being aware of his own lack of centrality. This awareness, however, does not bring immediate peace. It brings vertigo. In Pascal, man is a disproportionate being. He does not fit comfortably either into the finite or into the infinite. When he looks at the infinitely great, he sees his own insignificance. When he looks at the infinitely small, he realizes that he also does not master the depths of matter. He stands in the middle, between extremes that go beyond him. He fully understands neither the beginning nor the end. He masters neither everything nor nothing. His condition is intermediate, and that is exactly why it disturbs him. Man is not pure spirit or pure matter. He is not God, but neither is he a mere thing. He carries within himself a calling toward truth, and at the same time, severe limits that keep him from fully possessing it. Maybe the deepest thing in Pascal is his understanding that human suffering does not come only from physical pain or biological finitude, but from the imbalance between what we desire and what we are able to sustain. Man wants greatness because in some way he senses that he was made for more than mere animal life. He wants justice, truth, happiness, permanence, meaning. He is not easily satisfied with what is immediate. There is in him a hunger that the world cannot completely fill. But this same openness toward something higher crashes into his concrete fragility. He wants to last, and he dies. He wants to know, and he remains ignorant. He wants stability, and he lives in change. He wants purity, and he discovers contradiction within himself. This clash between the desire for greatness and a miserable condition is the source of his permanent restlessness. That is why Pascal describes the human being as a creature incapable of true rest. In many fragments of Pensées, he shows that man constantly seeks distractions because he cannot bear to remain in front of himself. Silence threatens him. Solitude reveals him. Rest forces him to face his own condition. So he throws himself into occupations, ambitions, games, conflicts, entertainment, projects, and conversations not only for pleasure, but in order not to think about the emptiness within him. Divertisement, distraction, is a defense against the truth of his own fragility. Man runs after 1,000 things because he fears what he would find if he stood still in front of his finitude. This analysis feels incredibly current. Even today, with different language, what we see is the same movement, the difficulty of enduring self-awareness. The individual stays busy without end, looks for validation, consumes stimulation, fills every empty space with noise. He seems free, but often he is only running away. Pascal saw very early that man's greatest anguish is not simply suffering, but knowing that he suffers, knowing that he dies, knowing that he is contingent. Consciousness, which is his dignity, is also his wound. The thinking reed does not simply exist. He knows that he exists in a fragile way, and that knowledge makes him higher than matter, but also more tormented. At the same time, Pascal does not let this torment sink into absolute despair. Human greatness remains real, even when everything seems to point toward misery. The simple fact that man recognizes his own contradiction already places him above the unconsciousness of the rest of nature. To know oneself as miserable is itself a sign of greatness. To feel the distance between what one is and what one desires already reveals a dignity that cannot fit inside a purely material view of the human being. The problem is not wanting greatness. The problem is wanting to possess it as if we were already whole, self-sufficient, and complete. Pascal forces man to abandon the fantasy of sovereignty without, for that reason, denying his nobility. We are fragile, yes. Almost nothing can destroy us, but we are not only that. We also think, seek, question, and suffer consciously. We stand between nothingness and infinity, and this position is painful, precisely because it is elevated. A purely brute being would not feel this tension. A fully divine being would not suffer from it. The human being suffers because he shares in both sides without fully becoming either one. At the deepest level, Pascal's lesson is that true dignity does not lie in denying fragility, but in passing through it with lucidity. Man is not great because he rules the universe. He is great because he can know it without ever possessing it. He is not noble because he is invulnerable. He is noble because even as a reed, he thinks. And maybe all the tragedy and all the beauty of human existence are found right there. We are too fragile to glorify ourselves, but too conscious to reduce ourselves to nothing. For Kierkegaard, the question of the self is never superficial. It is not just about self-esteem, public image, or the desire for recognition. In The Sickness unto Death, the Danish philosopher shows that the self is not something we simply receive ready-made. A human being has to become himself. And that is exactly where the torment begins. Because building an authentic self requires facing a difficult truth. Existence itself is already a tension. The desire to be somebody, to be special, admired, or unique, often does not come from inner strength, but from escape. Escape from a deeper despair, the despair of existing without any guarantees of greatness. Kierkegaard understands the self as a relation that turns back upon itself. That may sound abstract, but it describes something very concrete. A human being does not simply live. He knows that he lives. He does not simply act. He reflects on what he does. He does not simply suffer. He asks himself who he is within that suffering. So the self is never a static thing. It is a difficult synthesis between the finite and the infinite, between what limits us and what we imagine we could become. A person is always caught between what he already is and what he dreams of being. And when that relation breaks down or becomes distorted, despair is born. In Kierkegaard's thought, despair is not just intense sadness or visible emotional collapse. It can be silent, elegant, functional. A person can seem well-adjusted on the outside and still live in despair on the inside. This happens because despair, at its root, is the self being out of alignment with itself. Some people do not want to be who they are because they feel too small, too limited, too ordinary. Others want to be themselves in a proud and absolute way, as if they could establish their own value completely on their own. In both cases, the person fails to rest in themselves. They cannot accept their own condition without masking it. This is where the idea of the crowd becomes so important. Kierkegaard sees the crowd as a spiritual danger because the individual dissolves inside it. Instead of becoming a true self, he starts living through reflections, other people's opinions, trends, social expectations, outside standards of importance. The crowd offers a kind of anesthesia. It allows a person to avoid the loneliness of individual responsibility. Instead of asking, "Who am I before the truth?" the person asks, "How can I be seen? How can I be accepted? How can I seem like somebody?" In this way, the person trades inwardness for approval. And in that trade, he loses himself. The search to be special often comes from exactly this emptiness. Someone who cannot bear the simple task of existing as an individual looks for compensation in the fantasy of being exceptional. Instead of facing the hard work of building a self, they look for signs of distinction. They want to stand out, be remembered, impress others, prove some kind of superiority. But Kierkegaard helps us see that this obsession may be nothing more than despair in disguise. The person does not necessarily want to be true. They want to escape the anxiety of being merely human. They want to turn existence into a performance, so they do not have to face the inner silence where the real question is still waiting. Who am I when no one is watching? This point becomes even stronger when we connect the sickness unto death with fear and trembling. In that book, Kierkegaard works with the figure of Abraham as the knight of faith, someone who enters into an absolute relationship with the absolute. What matters there is not literally copying Abraham's action, but understanding that true subjective existence does not rest on the crowd. For Kierkegaard, faith is not social comfort. It is loneliness, risk, trembling. Abraham is not great because he was recognized by the group, but because he carried an inward relationship that no one else could validate from the outside. This reveals something central. The authentic self is not built through public approval, but through an inner responsibility that cannot be handed over to anyone else. This lesson is hard because it tears down a very modern illusion. We usually think we become somebody when we gather visibility, distinction, or social uniqueness. Kierkegaard turns that logic upside down. For him, the real problem is not failing to be famous, admired, or extraordinary. The real problem is failing to become yourself. And that can happen just as easily to an unknown person as to someone celebrated by everyone. Public admiration does not cure despair if the individual remains far from his own center. Being seen is not the same as existing authentically. That is why the desire to be somebody can be spiritually misleading. It looks like ambition, but very often it is fear. Fear of seeming ordinary. Fear of not having a grand identity. Fear of discovering that human life does not come with special guarantees. Kierkegaard sees that the desperate person would rather dream of an extraordinary version of themselves than accept the concrete task of becoming who they are, with limits, contradictions, and responsibility. The idealized self becomes an escape. Instead of living in reality, the person starts living by comparing themselves to images of greatness. There is something deeply current in this. In a world where everyone feels pressure to stand out, build a personal brand, and prove their relevance all the time, Kierkegaard's reflection becomes even stronger. Today, the crowd is not just the public square or the opinion of the majority. It also appears in metrics, instant validation, and constant recognition. The individual is constantly tempted to measure their value by the visibility they achieve. But the more they try to seem unique, the more they may become trapped by the impersonal gaze of others. They want to be special, but shape themselves according to collective expectations. They want to affirm a self, but live by outside standards. This does not remove despair. It only makes it more sophisticated. Kierkegaard insists that the most important truth is subjective, in the sense that it must be lived inwardly. It is not enough to understand concepts about the self. One must exist truthfully, and truthful existence requires the courage to stand alone before oneself and before God, without hiding in the crowd, without numbing oneself through comparison, without turning life into a race for exceptionality. The authentic self is not born from the fantasy of being more than others. It is born from the willingness to take one's own existence as a task. Kierkegaard shows that the suffering involved in wanting to be somebody almost always hides something more radical, the difficulty of accepting that existence itself is already enough of a problem and enough of a calling. A person wants to be special because they are afraid to face their spiritual nakedness. They want to be extraordinary because they cannot bear being only an individual before eternity. But the way out is not to inflate the ego. It is to abandon that escape. For Kierkegaard, greatness is not found in standing out in the crowd, but in becoming yourself in truth. And that is far more difficult and far more serious than simply being noticed. In Being in Time, Heidegger offers one of the sharpest descriptions of everyday life, precisely because he shows something that almost everyone feels, even if they cannot always name it: the strange experience of living without truly inhabiting your own existence. A person wants to be unique, wants to believe they have a singular identity, wants to think they are choosing their own path. But in practice, they often live dissolved in the impersonal, in what Heidegger calls the they. It is not exactly I think, I want, or I decide. It is this is how things are done. This is how people think. This is how life is lived. The person starts existing according to collective expectations, trends, standards of performance, and social validation, as if their life were always being guided by an anonymous logic. This they is one of Heidegger's most powerful ideas because it reveals how impersonality shapes everyday life. It is not just about social influence in a superficial sense. It is about the way a person, almost without noticing, learns to feel, judge, desire, and interpret life based on what everyone does. The impersonal has no face, but it has enormous power. It decides what counts as success, what seems shameful, what deserves attention, what should be desired, feared, or displayed. A person believes they are simply living their own life, when in reality, many of their choices have already been pre-shaped by this collective environment. Their uniqueness becomes more imagined than real. Heidegger points out that this way of living is not some rare accident, but the most common form of human existence. A human being, or Deseing, is always thrown into a world that has already been interpreted. Before making any choices, the person already finds languages, values, habits, priorities, and expectations circulating around them. This means no one starts from zero. We all enter a ready-made network of meaning. The problem is not that in itself. The problem begins when the individual gives themselves over so completely to that network that they stop confronting their own existence as truly theirs. Instead of taking ownership of life, they settle into the way one lives. That is where inauthentic life begins. And it is important to understand that, for Heidegger, inauthentic does not mean fake in a moralistic sense, as if someone were consciously pretending all the time. Inauthenticity is more subtle. It is a way of existing in which the person loses themselves in everyday life, absorbed by tasks, distractions, conversations, duties, and expectations that pull them away from the fundamental question of their own being. They keep functioning, producing, reacting, and relating. But they do all of this in a state of dispersion. They live without truly taking on the fact that their life is finite, singular, and cannot be handed over to anyone else. Heidegger describes this condition with an almost uncomfortable precision. In everyday life, the individual tends to fall into the superficiality of idle talk, endless curiosity, and ambiguity. Idle talk is when people repeat what is circulating, what people say, without any real experience of it. Curiosity is the constant search for novelty, not in order to go deeper, but to jump from one stimulus to another. Ambiguity is the state in which everything seems understood and discussed, but nothing is truly made one's own. These structures make life seem full, when in fact it is often just saturated with noise. Everyday life becomes a non-stop flow of activity without inwardness. This picture is especially powerful because it shows that emptiness does not always appear as absence. Very often, it appears as excess. Excess of information, activity, opinion, comparison, performance. A person is always doing something, always rushing, always updating themselves, always exposing themselves, or measuring themselves. And still, they feel a strange lack of substance. Heidegger helps explain this uneasiness. The person is not really living from themselves, but from the impersonal. Their schedule may be full, but their existence remains uninhabited. There is a central irony in this process. The individual wants to be unique, but looks for that uniqueness using the tools of conformity. They want to build a singular identity by obeying the same standards that organize everyone else's life. They want to seem authentic according to trends. They want to feel valuable through outside metrics. They want to be admired for matching well with what their environment rewards. In this way, even the desire to be different gets absorbed by the impersonal. A person imagines they are affirming themselves, when in reality, they are only adapting their image to recognizable forms of social approval. The self becomes a performance project. This submission to the impersonal does not need to come with explicit obedience. In fact, it almost never does. What is most disturbing is that it is often felt as freedom. A person chooses between options, has opinions about everything, shapes their appearance, organizes their tastes, builds narratives about themselves. But Heidegger forces us to ask, to what extent are these choices really owned as one's own? To what extent are they simply moves that were already expected within the horizon of the they? Inauthentic life is not a visible prison. It is a loss of self that happens in a comfortable, functional, almost normal way. That is why Heidegger insists so much on the need for an existential awakening. This awakening does not happen when someone simply adopts alternative tastes or dramatically rejects conventions. That, too, can become a pose. Authenticity, in Heidegger's sense, begins when the individual is pulled out of everyday dispersion and confronted with their own finitude. Anxiety plays a decisive role here. Unlike fear, which always has a defined object, anxiety dissolves the familiar world of everyday life and reveals the strangeness of existence. Suddenly, what seems solid loses its certainty. The world of the they begins to shake, and the person realizes that their life, in the deepest sense, is their own responsibility. The awareness of death is central to this movement. For Heidegger, death is not just a biological event at the end of life. It is the individual's own most possibility, the one no one else can live in their place. When a human being seriously faces their condition as a being toward death, the anesthesia of the impersonal begins to break. The expectations of the crowd lose some of their charm. The noise of comparison loses some of its authority. This does not mean abandoning the world or becoming indifferent to others, but recovering the weight of one's own existence. Authenticity appears when the person accepts that their life cannot be outsourced. This idea is deeply uncomfortable because it demands more than superficial rebellion. It demands appropriation. It is not enough to reject today's trend only to follow another tomorrow. It is not enough to swap one standard of validation for another. What Heidegger asks is more radical, that the person stop living on the automatic pilot of the impersonal and begin choosing from a more lucid relationship with their own finitude and real possibilities. It is a difficult call because everyday life offers 1,000 ways to escape. It is always easier to let life be lived than to truly live it. Heidegger shows that the emptiness of everyday life is not just in the repetition of routine, but in the loss of any real relationship with one's own being. A person dissolves into tasks, expectations, trends, and demands for performance until they no longer know how to tell what in them is genuine ownership and what is just absorption from the environment. They want to be unique, but live according to impersonal scripts. They want to feel authentic, but depend on validation to sustain their self-image. They want depth, but feed on distraction. The strength of being in time lies in revealing that inauthentic life is not the failure of a few people, but the constant temptation of almost everyone. The impersonal is comfortable because it saves us from the weight of existing on our own. But that comfort comes with a high cost. the silent dissolving of the self into collective normality. Heidegger offers no easy comfort. He offers a severe mirror, and that mirror shows that the greatest emptiness is not having nothing to do, but spending your whole life busy without ever truly taking responsibility for who you are. In Buddhism, one of the most unsettling ideas for the Western mind is also one of the most freeing. What we call the self is not a fixed, solid, separate essence, but an unstable construction that we cling to with great intensity. The doctrine of anatta, or non-self, directly challenges the fantasy of being someone special in the deepest and most narcissistic sense of the word. It is not just saying that you are not the center of the world. It is something even more radical. The very you, understood as a permanent, independent, and central entity, is already to a large extent an illusion. And it is precisely our attachment to that illusion that feeds suffering. This view runs through Buddhist teaching and appears in an ethical and practical way in texts like the Dhammapada. There, the mind holds a central place. We are what we think, one of its best-known passages says, in a loose translation of the spirit of the text. Human experience is shaped by the way the mind clings, interprets, desires, and reacts. The problem is not only that we suffer because of outside losses. The problem begins earlier, when the mind creates a self that must be protected, confirmed, admired, and preserved at all costs. From that point on, almost everything becomes a threat. Criticism, failure, being forgotten, comparison, change, death. Suffering grows because the person is not just living through events. They are defending a fixed image of themselves against a world that never stops changing. That is why Buddhism does not treat the ego as simple self-esteem or excessive pride. The target goes deeper. In this context, the ego is the persistent belief that there is some permanent core within us that can be separated from the flow of experience and called my true self. The individual then begins to think, my identity, my importance, my pain, my worth, my story. Everything gets organized around that sense of ownership. But Buddhism asks, where exactly is this stable self? In the body? The body changes constantly. In emotions? They arise and disappear. In thoughts? They are temporary. In memory? That too is fragmented and changing. In the will? It is inconsistent. What we find, if we observe carefully, is not an unmoving essence, but a collection of processes. This analysis appears in the doctrine of the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. What we call a person is, in Buddhism, a temporary combination of these elements. The mistake begins when we take this changing bundle to be a substantial and final identity. The fantasy of a special self is born right there. Instead of living the fluidity of existence, we freeze an image and begin serving it. We want it to be recognized, respected, desired, remembered. We want it to last. We want the world to confirm the story we tell ourselves about who we are. And because the world was not made to sustain that fiction, we suffer. The power of the idea of anatta is that it shows this suffering as not some secondary accident. It is born from attachment. We suffer because we cling to what is temporary as if it were permanent, to what is relational as if it were isolated, to what is made up of parts as if it were simple and solid. In other words, we suffer because we want to turn living experience into the property of the ego. Buddhism sees in this one of the main sources of dissatisfaction. When someone constantly needs to reaffirm who they are, prove that they matter, or defend a rigid identity, their life becomes fragile. Every change feels like a threat. Every loss feels like mutilation. Every kind of anonymity feels like annihilation. The person lives exhausted because they are always trying to hold up a center that is not as solid as they imagine. The Dhammapada repeatedly stresses mindfulness over the mind and self-mastery. not as some heroic performance, but as a path of freedom from this prison. The undisciplined mind chases desire, aversion, comparison, and illusion. The trained mind begins to see the conditioned nature of experience, and by seeing that, it reduces attachment. The point is not to erase practical individuality. Buddhism does not deny that there are people on the everyday level of life, with names, stories, and responsibilities. What it questions is the metaphysical and emotional belief in an absolute, fixed, separate self. There is an individual at the conventional level. What there is not is a substantial ego as the ultimate center of reality. This distinction matters because it avoids a common misunderstanding. Non-self does not mean that nothing exists or that human life has no value. It means that value does not depend on the fantasy of a rigid and special identity. In fact, when attachment to the ego weakens, our relationship with others tends to become more compassionate. If the self is not an isolated fortress, then the separation between my pain and someone else's pain loses some of its rigidity. Compassion stops being an abstract duty and becomes a natural result of seeing interdependence. The suffering of another person no longer feels so distant because identity itself is no longer understood as a closed block standing against the rest of the world. This also corrects vanity in a much more radical way than a simple morality of humility. Many traditions tell the individual to be modest. Buddhism goes further. It asks who exactly is demanding greatness. Who needs to be special? Who needs to win this invisible struggle for importance? When we observe the mind honestly, we see that this need for exceptionality grows out of fear. The ego wants to be special because it is afraid of dissolving into the common flow of existence. It wants to feel separate because it is afraid of not being in control. It wants permanence because it is afraid of impermanence. Pride, in this sense, is not strength, it is defense. That is why the Buddhist critique of the special self is so powerful. It does not just lower narcissism, it dismantles its whole structure. A person stops looking for salvation in their self-image. They stop imagining that they will finally be happy once their identity is fully affirmed. They realize that even this search was already part of the prison. As long as there is attachment to the ideas, I am this, I must be that, I need to be recognized as someone important, there will be tension, comparison, and fear. The mind will keep spinning around its own fiction. The Buddhist path points in another direction, not strengthening the ego, but seeing through it, not feeding the fantasy of centrality, but weakening the attachment that sustains it. This does not make life cold or empty. On the contrary, it can make it lighter. When a person no longer needs to constantly defend a fixed self, there is more room for attention, peace, and compassion. Experience still keeps happening: pain, pleasure, loss, joy, encounter, but without the same compulsion to turn everything into a mirror of identity. At its core, the doctrine of anatta offers one of the deepest critiques of the modern obsession with uniqueness. Suffering does not arise only because the world does not sufficiently recognize your worth. It arises first because you are attached to the fantasy of being a fixed, important, separate entity that needs to be constantly validated. Buddhism responds with austere clarity. The identity you are trying so desperately to protect is not as solid as it seems. And maybe freedom begins exactly when you stop demanding permanence from what was, from the very beginning, always in flux. In Buddhism, the idea of anicca, or impermanence, runs through all of human experience with devastating simplicity. Everything passes. Nothing that exists on the conditioned level remains identical to itself. Bodies change, emotions shift, relationships transform, achievements lose their shine, identities move, memories weaken, names are forgotten. This is not a pessimistic observation in some dramatic sense. It is a description of reality. And precisely because it is so simple, It strikes directly at one of the deepest fantasies of modern human beings. The idea that some part of themselves, their beauty, their success, their uniqueness, their recognition, will finally stabilize and guarantee some lasting form of value. Impermanence is disturbing because it wounds the ego's desire for continuity. A person wants to believe that if they reach a certain place, they will finally be confirmed. If they are admired enough, they will feel secure. If they build a strong enough identity, it will resist time. If they gain prestige, love, influence, or relevance, they will find some kind of rest. But Anika tears down that hope with rigor. Not because these things are unreal, but because they are temporary. They do happen. They can be intense, beautiful, even decisive at certain moments. They just cannot permanently support the image we build of ourselves. And suffering is born exactly when we demand permanence from what is, by nature, always in motion. This idea becomes especially powerful when we think about beauty. For centuries, human beings have linked beauty to power, desire, distinction, and social value. And even today, much of many people's self-esteem is quietly built on appearance. The problem is not in recognizing beauty or taking care of the body. The problem begins when someone tries to make appearance into a stable foundation for their identity. The body ages. Features change. Energy shifts. The image reflected in the mirror never stays the same. What inspires admiration today may no longer hold the same place tomorrow. Impermanence does not ask for permission. It slowly wears down everything the ego would like to freeze in place. The same is true of success. There is a particular cruelty in the way success seduces us, because it presents itself as a final answer. A person thinks, when I get there, when I prove my worth, when I am recognized, then something inside me will finally settle. But success is also subject to Anika. It depends on circumstances, context, people's opinions, markets, phases of life, and inner disposition. What looks like victory today may seem small, insufficient, or even irrelevant tomorrow. Very often, the achievement that was so deeply desired does not bring stability, but anxiety about maintaining it. The person not only wants to win, they begin to fear losing. And so what once looked like the solution becomes a new source of attachment. Social recognition may be even more fragile. Reputation depends on the memory of others, and the memory of others is notoriously unstable. Crowds become fascinated and forget very quickly. The name celebrated today may be ignored tomorrow. The image admired today may be questioned or replaced. Value that depends entirely on the highs of others is built on shifting ground. And yet so much of modern life is organized as if visibility could make up for our deeper insecurity. We want to be seen in order to feel real. We want to be remembered in order to feel lasting. We want to be recognized so we can believe our existence has left some mark. Buddhism, by reminding us of the impermanence of all these forms of validation, is not being cruel for the sake of cruelty. It is simply refusing a comforting lie. Even identity, which many people treat as the most intimate and stable core of the self, is shaped by Anika. A person changes opinions, affections, priorities, language, social roles, and worldview. The self of today is no longer the same as the one from 10 years ago, and probably will not be the same 10 years from now either. That can feel threatening, because we like to tell ourselves our life story as if there were some fixed center stitching everything together securely. But impermanence forces us to admit that even this continuity is, in part, a retrospective construction. There are relative continuities, of course. There are traits, habits, and tendencies. But none of that remains absolutely untouched. The flow runs through subjectivity, just as much as it runs through the body and the world. This is exactly where the Buddhist idea speaks to modern harshness. Contemporary people live as if it were possible to produce a final version of themselves, a solid image a fully resolved identity, a stable relevance, a lasting form of distinction. They work, post, consume, compare themselves, reinvent themselves, display themselves, and pressure themselves as if they needed to build a wall against time. But the world offers only flow. Everything moves faster than the ego can handle. Trends pass, standards change, reference points age, audiences scatter, and versions of the self become outdated. Modern life speeds up impermanence, but the human heart still longs for stability. This mismatch produces exhaustion, not only because everything changes, but because the person is constantly trying to turn change into permanence. They want to make youth into a lasting identity. They want to make success into a continuous state. They want to make approval into a possession. They want to make uniqueness into property. But none of these things can be possessed for long. And the more the individual insists on holding tightly to what is already slipping away, the more they suffer. The image is simple. Suffering does not come only from the fact that everything passes, but from the act of gripping tightly what was already passing. In Buddhism, recognizing anicca does not mean falling into despair or apathy. It means adjusting your vision to reality. Impermanence does not only destroy pleasure, it also dissolves pain. It does not only take away beauty, it also carries away humiliation. It does not only undo prestige, it also loosens wounds that once seemed eternal. Everything changes. And this realization, when it matures, can produce less panic and more sobriety. The problem is that the ego is selective. It wants pain to pass, but wants glory to stay. It wants to accept the impermanence of what hurts, but reject the impermanence of what feeds its self-image. Buddhism does not allow that partial negotiation. Everything that arises under conditions is subject to disappearance. There is a deep kind of humility in this view. If nothing can permanently support your exceptionality, then maybe it is necessary to abandon the hope of grounding your dignity in passing attributes. Beauty, success, identity, and recognition may all have a place in life, but they cannot carry the weight of justifying your being. When they try to occupy that place, they become sources of anxiety. The person begins living in constant vigilance, trying to preserve what was never made to last. Instead of inhabiting life, they manage anticipated losses. The power of anicca lies exactly in breaking this illusion before it turns into despair. Nothing can sustain your exceptionality because nothing conditioned was made to sustain it. The world does not offer fixed blocks. It offers processes. What you call my value, when it rests only on temporary forms, will always be vulnerable to time. And maybe that is the harshest and most freeing lesson of all. There is no permanence available to the ego in the realm of appearance, prestige, or identity. There is only flow. Accepting this does not mean despising life, but stopping the demand that life give what it cannot give. Beauty can be appreciated without being worshipped. Success can be lived without being turned into salvation. Recognition can be welcomed without becoming the foundation of the self. Identity can be inhabited without being frozen. When impermanence stops being treated as a personal insult, life loses some of its hysteria. A person no longer needs to defend their exceptionality at all costs, because they understand that the cost itself came from an impossible demand. Everything passes. And precisely because it passes, nothing can serve, in any stable way, as a throne for the ego. In the Tao Te Ching, traditionally attributed to Laozi, there is a kind of wisdom that quietly but deeply challenges the human obsession with uniqueness. Instead of praising the individual who stands out, proves his worth, and leaves his mark on the world, Taoism moves in another direction. It is suspicious of everything that is overly asserted, displayed, or forced. For Laozi, the more someone feels the need to prove their importance, the farther they probably are from true harmony. The obsession with being extraordinary does not reveal inner strength. Very often, It reveals inner disconnection. The wise person is not tormented by the need to seem unique, because they no longer measure life by comparison. They come into harmony with the flow of the Tao. This is a powerful reversal. In much of the modern mindset, the value of life seems to depend on the ability to stand out. Being ordinary almost sounds like failure. Being visible, memorable, exceptional, or unique has become an existential goal. A person feels they need to build a striking identity, rise above the crowd, prove that there is something special about them. Taoism looks at this with deep suspicion, not because it despises the concrete uniqueness of beings, but because it sees something artificial in the obsession with uniqueness. When someone tries too hard to be special, they have usually already moved away from spontaneity. They are no longer simply living. They are performing themselves. Laozi insists again and again on the importance of what does not put itself on display. What is deepest does not shout. What is truly strong does not constantly need to show its strength. What is in harmony with the Tao does not move through life with the anxiety of self-assertion. In the Tao Te Ching, there is a subtle but firm critique of the logic of excess. Too much ambition, too much self-consciousness, too much competition, too much force of will. The problem is not acting or existing with presence. The problem is forcing an identity, trying to pull importance out of the world through tension. The more the ego tries to establish itself as something special, the more rigid it becomes. And everything that becomes too rigid ends up losing touch with the living flow of reality. This is where emptiness takes on a decisive meaning. In Taoism, emptiness is not mere lack. It is potential, openness, readiness. Laozi uses famous images to show this. The usefulness of a wheel depends on the empty space at its center. The usefulness of a vessel depends on the emptiness it holds. The usefulness of a house depends on the inner space not filled by walls. Emptiness, then, is not useless absence. It is what makes function, receptivity, and life possible. Applied to the human being, this means that a life too full of self-assertion, rigid identity, and the effort to stand out can become spiritually barren. But a self emptied of pretension becomes more able to receive the movement of reality. This view is deeply anti-narcissistic. The ego wants rigid consistency. It wants to say, I am this. I am worth this. I need to be recognized in this way. Taoism, by contrast, values flexibility. The wise person does not need to lock themselves into a glorious image of who they are. They do not need to convince the world of their importance, because they are not living in a war against their own insignificance. They have already understood that the attempt to become extraordinary through force of will is, to a large degree, artificial. The Tao does not work through display. It acts quietly, gives life without noise, supports without possessing. The idea of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, helps a lot here. It does not mean lazy passivity, but a way of acting without violence against the course of things. The wise person acts, but not with the compulsion to impose themselves. They accomplish things, but they do not cling to the result as proof of identity. They take part in life without turning it into a stage for self-assertion. This is the opposite of the person obsessed with being special. Someone who desperately wants to stand out usually acts under tension. They are always trying to prove something, repair their image, secure a place for themselves. The Taoist sage lets go of that theatricality. Their strength comes from harmony, not self-promotion. That is why Taoist emptiness is fertile. It is not the depressive emptiness of someone who has lost all meaning, but the clear space of someone who is no longer saturated with themselves. When a person stops filling every gesture with the need to seem exceptional, a new openness appears inside them. They listen better, notice more, force less, and suffer less from comparison. Life regains a more organic rhythm. Instead of trying to squeeze narcissistic confirmation out of every experience, they learn to move with more simplicity. Emptiness, in this sense, is freedom from excess ego. Laozi also criticizes the desire for social and moral elevation when it turns into spectacle. Whoever displays virtue has already lost part of it. Whoever talks too much about wisdom may already be far from it. Whoever seeks glory moves away from the stillness needed to perceive the Tao. This does not mean that every form of excellence is false, but that real excellence does not need to become a display window. The wise person does not need to announce their depth. Their relationship with the world is less anxious because they do not measure their value by the place they occupy in the imagination of others. This lesson speaks very strongly to contemporary anxiety. Today, many people live as if they need to build a permanently striking identity. Everything seems to demand differentiation: image, opinion, life path, lifestyle, public presence. Even authenticity has become a kind of performance. A person wants to be unique, but pursues that uniqueness with enormous effort, constantly comparing themselves, trying to stand out in a world crowded with egos. The common result is exhaustion, artificiality, and restlessness. Laozi offers a radical correction. Maybe the problem is precisely that we are trying too hard to be somebody. In Taoism, everything already participates in the Tao without needing to justify its existence. A tree does not need to prove that it is unique. A river does not suffer because it is not extraordinary. The valley is valued precisely because of its receptive humility. The wise person moves closer to this natural logic. They do not erase their individuality, but they stop turning it into an obsessive project. Their life no longer revolves around the question, how can I become more special? But around something simpler and deeper. How can I live in harmony with the flow of reality? That changes everything. The tension of self-promotion gives way to the calm of participation. There is also a kind of humility here, but not a humiliated humility. Taoism does not tell the individual to despise themselves. It simply invites them to let go of excess centrality. The self steps down from the throne and becomes a point within a greater order that is fluid and inexhaustible. When that happens, life loses some of the dramatic rigidity with which the ego tries to defend itself. A person no longer needs to turn every detail into proof of worth. They can simply be, act, step back, wait, receive, without feeling that their existence depends on seeming extraordinary. Laozi shows that the obsession with uniqueness is artificial because it comes from a break with the Tao. When a person loses spontaneity, they try to make up for it with identity. When they lose the sense of belonging to the flow, they try to make up for it with self-importance. When they lose stillness, they try to make up for it with performance. The wise person takes the opposite path. They empty what was excess, release what was rigid, quiet what was showmanship. And precisely because of that, their life becomes fuller. The fertile emptiness of Taoism is, then, a quiet critique of the modern need to be extraordinary. The wise person does not need to prove that they matter, because they are no longer trapped in the logic of proof. They have already found a calmer way of existing, not as the center of the world, but as part of the movement of the Tao. And maybe there is a rare freedom in that. The freedom to live without turning your existence into a display case. The freedom of not needing to be exceptional in order to be at peace. In Zhuangzi, one of the most unsettling things is the way he destabilizes almost everything human beings usually take for granted. Our certainties, our standards, our distinctions, our strongest values, all of it begins to shake in his pages. And that is exactly why his philosophy is so powerful when thinking about the modern desire to be special. For Zhuangzi, the problem is not only individual pride, but the narrowness of the human point of view itself. A person believes their view of the world is central, that their values are natural, that their identity has some higher consistency. But that confidence is often nothing more than an illusion produced by a limited and self-centered perspective. Zhuangzi does not fight this illusion with a rigid system, but with images, parables, reversals, and irony. He shifts the point of view. He makes the reader realize that what once seemed absolute may only be relative to the position of the one looking. The famous story of the butterfly dream is a perfect example. Zhuangzi dreams he is a butterfly, and when he wakes up, he asks whether he was Zhuangzi dreaming he was a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming it is Zhuangzi. The philosophical power of this passage is not in offering a pointless riddle, but in shaking our automatic trust in fixed identity. What we call the self no longer seems so solid when the boundary between perspectives becomes uncertain. This uncertainty does not destroy human experience, but it corrects its arrogance. The ego wants stability, wants centrality, wants firm distinctions. It wants to know clearly where the world ends and where its own importance begins. Zhuangzi shows that this desire for firmness often comes from an inability to bear the fluidity of reality. Human beings organize chaos through categories and then fall in love with those categories. They say, this is noble, that is vulgar. This is great, that is small. This is valuable, that is insignificant. I am this, the other is that. But for Zhuangzi, these divisions reflect the limits of human perspective far more than the ultimate structure of reality. That is exactly where the desire to be special begins to fall apart, because the feeling of being exceptional depends on hierarchies. For someone to feel above others, unique, different, the world has to be organized in comparative terms. The self needs to measure itself, stand out, locate itself in a field of superiority and inferiority. But Zhuangzi deeply distrusts those hierarchies. What seems high from one point of view may seem low from another. What seems useful in one situation may seem useless in another. What one person calls glory, another may see as distortion. So the self's supposed specialness no longer appears as an essential truth, but as the effect of a narrow perspective trying to treat itself as universal. One of the most beautiful themes in Zhuangzi is his critique of the narrow utilitarian mindset of ordinary thought. In several passages, he shows that what is considered useless according to practical standards may have another kind of value. A crooked tree that is no good for carpentry survives, precisely because it does not fit the logic of immediate usefulness. This image matters because it tears down human standards of importance. A person thinks they are special because they see themselves as efficient, admired, functional, or superior according to accepted standards. But Zhuangzi suggests that those standards are already partial, conditioned, and small. The world is not limited to the narrow grid of human judgments. What seems worthless by one standard may turn out to be free by another. This relativizing should not be confused with total indifference or easy nihilism. Zhuangzi is not saying that nothing matters. He is saying that the rigidity with which the self clings to its distinctions is a source of illusion. A person believes their way of organizing reality is the correct one, and from there they build an inflated identity. They begin defending opinions, traits, and self-images as if they were defending their very being. But the more rigid that identity becomes, the narrower the vision gets. The self becomes trapped in its own outline and loses the ability to move with reality. The desire to be special then reveals itself less as a sign of greatness and more as a sign of being trapped inside a limited perspective. Zhuangzi has a rare gift for exposing the ridiculous side of human self-importance. In the face of the vastness of the Tao, our classifications look temporary, almost childish. Human beings take themselves very seriously because they do not see how small their frame of reference really is. They turn their biography into a center, their successes into a measure, their offenses into a cosmic drama. But the Zhuangzian perspective relativizes all of this without cruelty, almost with humor. He does not humiliate the individual. He simply shows that there is something almost funny about our insistence on turning a partial perspective into universal law. The ego thinks itself special because it sees too little and too closely. This critique is especially valuable in a time when everyone is pressured to present a defined identity, a personal brand, a visible uniqueness. Modern life intensifies the need to stand out. A person does not want only to exist. They want to hold a recognizable place in the symbolic hierarchy of the world. They want to prove they are more interesting, deeper, rarer, more important. But Chuangzi cuts through that anxiety with a quiet question. Special by what standard? Important to whom? Superior compared to what? When those questions are taken seriously, the solidity of self-importance begins to shake. There is also in Zhuangzi an implicit defense of lightness. Whoever clings too tightly to the self becomes heavy. They carry their definitions like armor. They react to everything as if it were a threat to their image. They become unable to flow. But someone who recognizes the relativity of perspectives gains inner mobility. They no longer need to win every symbolic battle. They stop turning every difference into a hierarchy. They stop living as if the world were organized to confirm their identity. This does not mean erasing oneself, but relaxing the self-centered tension that turns life into a stage for constant self-assertion. This point is decisive. Zhuangzi does not propose the violent destruction of the self, but the dissolving of its rigidity. The self still exists on the level of ordinary experience, with its body, its history, its voice. What dissolves is the claim to absolute centrality. The person realizes that their perspective is one among many, that their standards do not exhaust reality, that their certainties are less final than they seemed. And this realization can be deeply freeing. After all, much of suffering comes from the need to hold up a rigid image of oneself in front of a world that is far wider and more changeable than the ego would like. At the deepest level, Zhuangzi invites a spiritual shift. Instead of living by defending hierarchies of the self, a person could learn to live within fluidity. Instead of insisting on being special, they could recognize the limits of that very need. Instead of reducing the world to the scale of their own pride, they could open themselves to the vastness of the Tao, where human oppositions become less absolute. Greatness, then, would not lie in placing oneself above others, but in no longer needing that superiority in order to exist. Zhuangzi's philosophy is radical, precisely because it corrects vanity by widening perspective. When the view expands, the ego shrinks, not because the person becomes worthless, but because they understand that their worth does not depend on sitting on an imaginary throne. The desire to be special appears, then, as just one more illusion produced by a narrow, anxious, and self-centered point of view. And maybe there is a rare kind of freedom in accepting that. The freedom of not needing to turn your identity into a hierarchy. The freedom of existing without the constant burden of proving that you are more than you are. In the Analects, Confucius offers a powerful contrast to the modern obsession with uniqueness. For him, the value of a life does not lie in being extraordinary, attention-grabbing, or inwardly special in some romantic sense. It lies in something far less glamorous and far more demanding. Building character, fulfilling duty, acting with integrity, learning how to measure oneself, and treating others properly. Human dignity, in this view, does not come from the belief that each person has some secret exceptional quality waiting to be recognized. It comes from conduct. A person has worth not because they are rare, but because they can become just. This difference is decisive. Today, many people have been taught to think that living well means discovering something unique inside themselves, affirming a singular identity, proving authenticity, and standing out from the crowd. Confucius takes a different path. He does not begin by asking what is special about you. He asks how you act, how you speak, how you learn, how you respond to your responsibilities, how you behave toward others and toward yourself. The center of ethical life is not self-expression, but self-formation. That completely changes the weight of existence. The individual stops looking for greatness in self-image and begins looking for it in the discipline of character. In the Analects, the human ideal is the Junzi, often translated as noble person or exemplary person. The important point is that this ideal does not depend on birth, fame, or genius. The Junzi is not someone naturally superior to others because of some inner essence. It is someone who morally educates themselves. They learn to govern their impulses, speak with prudence, act with justice, respect ritual, honor relationships, and correct themselves before blaming the world. This is very different from a culture that measures value by the intensity of personality or the ability to stand out. In Confucius, excellence has less to do with brilliance and more to do with consistency. This view also corrects a very common illusion, the idea that dignity depends on being exceptional. Many people suffer because they believe they will only have value if they are different, admired, or above average in some decisive way. Confucius quietly takes apart that anxiety. The value of life does not lie in seeming special, but in living rightly. A person can be socially discreet, intellectually modest, even outwardly ordinary, and still possess great dignity. That dignity does not come from self-image. It comes from the way they treat others, honor their duties, and govern themselves. In the Analects, there is a constant insistence on moral learning. Confucius does not present virtue as something spontaneous in some naive sense. Becoming an upright person requires formation, repetition, correction, and attention to the details of living with others. This matters because it brings greatness back into the field of ethical effort, not the field of self-celebration. A person does not need to discover that they are extraordinary. They need to learn to be trustworthy, just, respectful, and balanced. In a time when so many people want to be seen as unique, Confucius invites us to something much more sober, to be decent. Another central point is the value of li, ritual, or proper forms of conduct. At first glance, this may seem conservative or overly formal. But in Confucius, rituals serve a deeply human purpose. They educate the ego. They teach a person not to act only from impulse, desire, or convenience. By respecting forms, roles, and duties, the individual learns that they are not the absolute center of reality. They learn to place themselves within relationships, family, political, social, human. This does not erase them. On the contrary, it civilizes them. The person stops treating the world as an extension of their own desires and begins to recognize that living well requires measure. This sense of measure is inseparable from the idea of Ren, often translated as humanity, benevolence, or human virtue. For Confucius, the truly valuable person is the one who develops humanity in concrete actions. It is not enough to have high intentions or to cultivate an inner image of depth. Humanity has to show up in conduct, in respect for one's parents, loyalty, sincerity, moderation, care for others, and the willingness to correct oneself. A person's value, then, is not some secret flame to be admired, but a visible practice of decency. This creates a less narcissistic view of life. Instead of asking, "How can I be someone special?" the person begins to ask, "How can I act rightly?" Instead of organizing life around recognition, they organize it around responsibility. Instead of chasing a grand identity, they try to become trustworthy. This shift is enormous. It reduces the drama of the ego and strengthens the seriousness of ethics. The problem of life stops being the lack of exceptionality and becomes the lack of moral formation. Confucius is also important because he links dignity to self-correction. The exemplary person is not someone who never makes mistakes, but someone who does not remain in error out of pride. In the Analects, there is constant praise for intellectual and moral humility. To learn means to accept limits. To correct yourself means giving up vanity. In other words, true greatness does not lie in maintaining a flawless image of yourself, but in allowing your character to be shaped. This stands in sharp contrast to the modern desire to seem finished, authentic, and admirable all the time. For Confucius, someone who only wants to preserve their image will rarely mature. There is also an important political side to this view. Confucius understands that social order depends less on brilliant individuals than on upright ones. A society does not improve because everyone believes they are special. It improves when people take on their roles with responsibility and justice. The ruler should govern with virtue. The child should honor the parents. The friend should be loyal. The student should learn seriously. This emphasis may sound simple, but it carries a deep idea. Ordinary life, when lived with integrity, has more value than empty grandeur. The world does not need inflated egos. It needs character. This is perhaps Confucius's strongest contribution to this debate. He offers importance without grandeur. He shows that a life can be noble without being spectacular, that a person can have dignity without holding on to the fantasy of being unique in some absolute sense, that human value does not need to be found in the mysterious depth of some exceptional inner self, but in the clarity of upright conduct. Instead of inflating the self, Confucius disciplines it. Instead of promising uniqueness, he demands formation. Instead of comforting narcissism, he calls for responsibility. The Analects teach something deeply countercultural. You do not need to be special in order to live with dignity. You need to be upright. That does not sound grand, but maybe that is exactly why it is so difficult. The ego would rather imagine itself as rare than submit to the patient work of virtue. It would rather dream of authenticity than practice integrity. It would rather seek recognition than quietly correct itself. Confucius dismantles that illusion with calm clarity. The importance of a life does not lie in its claim to uniqueness, but in the moral quality of its actions. This lesson remains relevant because it touches one of the wounds of our time. Many people suffer because they do not feel extraordinary. Confucius would answer that they are looking for value in the wrong place. Dignity does not come from being some human exception. It comes from cultivating humanity. It does not come from seeming superior. It comes from becoming upright. And maybe there is in that a more sober, more stable, and more mature kind of greatness. Not the greatness of someone who shines above others, but the greatness of someone who lives with character among others. In Nietzsche, the death of God is not just a religious attack or a shocking phrase meant to provoke people. In the gay science, especially in the famous aphorism of the madman, it appears as a historical and spiritual diagnosis. The absolute foundations that once organized the meaning of Western life are collapsing. God is dead means that culture can no longer believe with the same force in a transcendent center that guarantees truth, goodness, order, and value. Modern man therefore loses much more than a belief. He loses an axis, and with that axis, he also loses the illusion of protected centrality. There is no longer a supreme authority ensuring that his life holds a previously justified place in the cosmos. This experience is deeply unsettling and exposing. For centuries, reference to God offered not only spiritual comfort, but an ontological structure. Suffering could be placed within a larger plan. Morality had a transcendent foundation. Human dignity seemed guaranteed by a higher origin and a higher destiny. Even man's smallness could be endured, because there was a divine order in which that smallness still made sense. Nietzsche sees that when this order begins to fail, it is not just one doctrine that falls. It is the whole architecture of meaning that had supported the European soul. Modern man wakes up in a world where the old foundations no longer convince, but new ones have not yet been created. That is why the death of God does not bring immediate freedom. Before anything else, it brings vertigo. In the aphorism from the gay science, The madman asks, "Are we not wandering as through an infinite nothing?" That image is decisive. Without an absolute foundation, man no longer knows what is up or down. He loses the fixed directions of value. The world no longer offers him a ready-made hierarchy. And what is revealed in that moment is silence. There is no answer from above. There is no external guarantee that human life has an assured intrinsic importance. The universe does not reorganize itself to comfort those who have lost God. It remains silent. This silence wounds man exactly where he was most dependent, because deep down, belief in absolute foundations also supported a fantasy of centrality. If God creates man in his image, if history has a moral direction, if the cosmos participates in an ordered meaning, then human existence is not a naked accident. It has backing. Nietzsche tears away that backing, and by tearing it away, he exposes the individual to a much more austere condition. You are not the center of a guaranteed metaphysical order. There is no final authority making sure that your suffering, your virtues, or your identity already have value. Modern man finds himself abandoned to the task of creating values without a cosmic father. This is real helplessness. Not just the emotional helplessness of feeling alone, but the spiritual helplessness of realizing that there is no ready-made ultimate foundation to legitimize life. Nietzsche is radical because he does not try to numb this discovery. He does not quickly replace God with some other comforting absolute. On the contrary, he wants man to go all the way through the experience. The collapse of foundations is also the collapse of excuses. It is no longer possible to hide behind eternal commandments, as if they could automatically guarantee the meaning of existence. Responsibility grows in the same measure that protection disappears. And thus spoke Zarathustra. This demand takes on a more poetic and harsher tone. Zarathustra does not appear to restore old foundations, but to call man to overcome himself. The central point is that, without inherited absolutes, man must become a creator of values. This does not mean making up random rules, as if Nietzsche were defending childish arbitrariness. It means something more serious, recognizing that value does not fall from the sky already finished, and that human life must affirm meaning without depending on the crutch of a guaranteed metaphysical order. Modern man loses protection, and precisely because of that, he must grow up. But that maturity is not easy at all, because human beings would rather obey than create. They would rather receive value than produce it. They would rather accept an inherited morality, even a heavy one, than face the dangerous freedom of valuing. There is comfort in being guided. There is relief in imagining that the good has already been defined by a supreme authority. Nietzsche knows this, and that is why he criticizes herd morality so fiercely. When people cannot bear the emptiness left by the death of God, they tend to replace it with new forms of protection. Ideologies, conformism, collective resentment, secularized moral idols. The names change, but the dependence remains. The fear of freedom keeps looking for substitute fathers. So the great Nietzschean question is not only to notice the death of God, but to ask who is capable of living after it without falling into passive nihilism. Because one thing is to lose your foundations. Another is to endure that loss without deciding that nothing matters. This is the danger for modern man. After losing belief in a given absolute value, he may slide into exhaustion, indifference, and the feeling that everything is equal and therefore empty. Nietzsche wants to prevent that fall. His answer is not to restore old absolutes, but to call for a higher affirmation, the ability to create values out of the strength of life itself. Here, the loss of centrality takes on a decisive meaning. Man can no longer think of himself as protected by a transcendent order that places him at the center of the cosmic drama. That is hard, but also freeing. He stops being the protected child of a paternal metaphysics. He becomes responsible for what he does with the emptiness. The absence of guarantees does not remove the need for value. It only changes where value comes from. Meaning will not be given. It will have to be created, sustained, and tested in experience. And that requires a kind of courage that few people have, the courage to exist without supreme approval. Zarathustra represents exactly this crossing. He speaks of self-overcoming, faithfulness to the earth, creation, dancing, and affirmation. All of this points to a life that does not need to justify itself by appealing to some beyond. The death of God cuts the bond with transcendent foundation, but it opens the demand for a new nobility. Not the nobility of someone who obeys well, but the nobility of someone who creates without protection. Not the nobility of someone who finds safety in an absolute center, but of someone who carries the risk of freedom. Of course, this freedom has a price. Without God as foundation, man loses the comfort of a guaranteed narrative. Suffering is no longer automatically filled with meaning. Injustice will no longer be corrected by some assured final authority. Morality itself no longer has a metaphysical guarantor. The silence of God, or rather the silence left behind by his cultural death, exposes the nakedness of the human condition. Nothing outside of us guarantees that our values are eternal. Nothing spares us from the task of justifying them within life itself. That may seem cruel, and in a certain sense, it is. But Nietzsche would prefer that cruelty to a comforting lie. For him, the greatness still possible for man begins when he stops asking for protection. Spiritual maturity begins when the individual accepts that there is no given centrality, no absolute foundation, and no cosmic father to save him from responsibility. To invent value without protection is a dangerous, fragile, and demanding task. But it is also the only task worthy of an age that can no longer innocently believe in inherited absolutes. The death of God marks the moment when modern man loses the illusion of being metaphysically sheltered. The sky falls silent, and the void appears. Nietzsche offers no easy shelter in the face of this helplessness. He offers something harder, the demand to turn loss into creation. Man is no longer the center of a guaranteed order, and for that very reason, he must learn to live without protection, without excuses, and without guarantees creating, in the silence, the values by which he will have the courage to exist. In the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus begins with a simple and devastating realization. Human beings want meaning, clarity, order, and justification. The world, however, does not answer that demand. It is from this clash between the human hunger for meaning and the silence of the universe that the absurd is born. The absurd is not only in the world and not only in us. It arises in the relationship between a consciousness that asks questions and a reality that does not give the answer it expects. And that is exactly why Camus' philosophy strikes human narcissism so hard. You are not special to the universe, and it does not owe you explanations. This idea is difficult to accept because it goes against a very deep desire. Almost everyone, at some level, wants to believe that their life is part of some greater order, that pain has a justification, that effort will be rewarded by some hidden meaning, that individual suffering matters to the structure of reality. Camus rejects that comfort. For him, the universe does not confirm our metaphysical expectations. It does not guarantee justice. It does not offer a pre-written script, and it does not hand out meaning like some spiritual inheritance. Human beings ask why, but the world remains silent. And that silence is not cruelty. It is simply the condition in which we exist. That is what Camus calls the absurd. It does not mean that life is meaningless in some shallow or teenage way, as if nothing had value and everything were gray. The absurd is more precise and more philosophical than that. It means that we do not find in the world a ready-made meaning that matches our desire for total intelligibility. We want final reasons, but we find contingency. We want a moral order written into the cosmos, but we find indifference. We want existence to answer our thirst for meaning, but it does not answer. The absurd is born from this mismatch. Camus insists that the truly serious philosophical question is suicide, precisely because, if life offers no guaranteed foundation, then the temptation arises to ask whether it is worth living at all. But his answer is not surrender. He does not conclude that because there is no given meaning, everything collapses into despair. On the contrary, Camus' central move is to reject both physical escape and metaphysical escape. Physical escape would mean leaving life behind. Metaphysical escape would mean artificially inventing some transcendent meaning just to escape the absurd. Camus rejects both. For him, honesty requires remaining in front of the absurd without lying and without running away. This is where the figure of Sisyphus becomes decisive. Condemned by the gods to push a rock up a mountain forever, only to watch it roll back down again, Sisyphus represents repetition without redemption. His labor does not end in final victory, does not produce a lasting legacy, and does not receive any comforting explanation. The image seems hopeless, and that is exactly why Camus chooses it. It captures the human experience of effort without guarantees. We live, we try, we build, we begin again, we lose, we keep going. There is no promise that the universe will turn this movement into objective meaning. And yet Camus ends with one of the most famous lines in modern philosophy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. That happiness, of course, is not naive joy. It is lucidity. Sisyphus becomes greater than his fate the moment he recognizes it without illusions. The problem does not disappear, but consciousness changes everything. Once he knows there is no given meaning, he no longer waits for metaphysical reward. He no longer begs for explanations. He no longer humiliates himself before a promise that does not exist. His revolt lies in living without appeal. And this matters deeply. For Camus, human greatness does not lie in receiving an answer from the universe, but in continuing to live without one. At this point, the critique of the feeling of being special becomes very clear. Human beings suffer not only because life is hard, but because they expect from life a kind of special consideration. They want the universe to recognize their pain, confirm their importance, justify their effort. They want there to be, in some way, a correspondence between their inner life and the structure of reality. Camus cuts that expectation at the root. The universe does not owe you attention. It does not owe you meaning. It does not even owe you moral coherence. That may sound cruel, but it is also a severe kind of freedom. When we stop demanding cosmic justifications, we stop living like frustrated metaphysical creditors. This lucidity does not make life less intense. On the contrary, it can make it more alive. Instead of waiting for a final explanation, the absurd person turns toward concrete experience. He knows there is no guaranteed eternity, and precisely because of that, he pays more attention to the moment. He knows there is no pre-written script, and so he takes more responsibility for the way he lives. He knows no transcendent order will come to crown his existence, and so he learns to inhabit his own finitude more truthfully. The loss of guarantees does not destroy lived value. It only prevents that value from being outsourced to some beyond. Camus also shows that the absurd demands revolt. Not the hysterical revolt of someone refusing to accept reality, but the dignified revolt of someone who faces the human condition without kneeling before false promises. To live absurdly is to say yes to life without its metaphysical decorations. It is to keep creating, loving, struggling, thinking, and breathing, even while knowing that the universe offers no final foundation for any of it. This posture is hard because it removes all protection. No one is coming to explain your existence for you. No one will guarantee that your losses fit into some higher plan. No one will make sure that your suffering has cosmic value. And still, you live. There is something deeply mature in this. Most people prefer either the comfort of illusion or the collapse of despair. Camus offers a third path, lucidity without surrender. Accepting that there is no ready-made meaning does not mean concluding that everything is indifferent. It means recognizing that the value of life will not arrive packaged from outside. It will be lived, created, and sustained within the limits of the human condition itself. That does not solve the absurd. It only prevents us from being destroyed by it. Maybe that is why Camus still feels so current. Modern people still want guarantees. They want explanations for their pain, signs that their life matters more than it does, some proof that the universe is not indifferent. But the world remains silent. And for Camus, that silence does not have to mean the end of dignity. It can be the beginning of a more honest existence. You are not special to the universe, and it does not owe you explanations. That idea wounds pride, no doubt, but it also cuts through a childish illusion that keeps us dependent on answers that never come. The myth of Sisyphus teaches that living without guarantees is not a curse to be endlessly mourned. It is the very condition of lucidity. The universe does not hand us ready-made meaning, but that does not force us to disappear. It forces us to wake up. And once we are awake, maybe what remains is something more sober and stronger than comfort. The courage to keep pushing the rock without lies, without the hope of protection, and without demanding from the world an explanation it never promised to give. With Byung-Chul Han, the problem takes on an even crueler and more contemporary form. It is no longer enough to deal with the philosophical wound of discovering that you are not the center of the world, that there are no metaphysical guarantees, and that your existence does not come wrapped in natural exceptionalism. Now there is a new layer of suffering, living in a culture that constantly demands that you seem special, productive, interesting, unique, and desirable. Modern cruelty is not just realizing that you are not extraordinary to the universe. It is being pressured every day to prove the opposite to others and to yourself. In the Burnout Society, Byung-Chul Han describes the shift from a disciplinary society based on prohibition to an achievement society based on positivity. Before, worked mostly through "you must not." Now it works through "you can do it." You can be anything. Be your best self. Reinvent yourself. Surpass yourself. At first glance, this looks freeing. But Han shows that this positivity comes with an enormous psychological cost. When the individual is convinced that everything depends on them, on their performance, on their ability to stand out, they begin to exploit themselves. They no longer need a clearly identifiable external oppressor. They themselves become boss and worker, taskmaster, and exhausted subject, project, and product. This is exactly where the demand to be special becomes exhausting. Contemporary people do not suffer only because they are ordinary, limited, or replaceable. They suffer because they live in an environment that turns uniqueness into an obligation. It is not enough to exist. You have to stand out. It is not enough to work. You have to perform excellence. It is not enough to have a life. You have to turn it into something visible, interesting, tellable, admirable. Identity stops being something lived and becomes something managed. A person has to constantly prove value, relevance, and originality. And because that standard never settles, the result is exhaustion. Han is very precise in showing that today's violence rarely looks like violence. It disguises itself as freedom, choice, self-expression, and opportunity. The individual believes they are fulfilling themselves, when in many cases they are only obeying a new kind of coercion. They want to be unique, but that desire has already been absorbed by the system. Uniqueness has become a market demand, a logic of exposure, a mechanism of competitive differentiation. Even authenticity has been captured. The individual has to seem spontaneous, but in a readable way. Has to be original, but within recognizable patterns. Has to stand out without falling outside the game of approval. This creates a very specific kind of suffering. A person never quite knows whether they are living or just managing their own image. In The Expulsion of the Other, Hahn deepens this critique by showing how contemporary culture keeps eliminating real otherness. The other person, instead of appearing as a difference that unsettles me, challenges me, and forces me out of myself, gets reduced to the same. Everything tends to be filtered through narcissistic mirrors. The individual looks for confirmation, not encounter, validation, not confrontation, sameness, not strangeness. This connects directly to the obsession with being exceptional. A person wants to be special, but within an environment where everyone is trapped in the same logic of self-promotion and self-affirmation. The result is paradoxical. The more each person tries to become singular, the more everyone starts to resemble one another in their anxiety to seem unique. This is one of the great cruelties of the present. Culture sells difference, but produces repetition. It sells freedom, but produces self-exploitation. It sells authenticity, but produces performance. The individual believes they are affirming their self, when in reality, they are submitting to a psychological economy that demands constant visibility, non-stop performance, and permanent positivity. They have to be interesting all the time. They have to show growth, opinion, identity, presence. They have to turn even rest into a strategy of optimization. Life no longer has spaces of silence. Everything is called to perform, to mean something, to become part of an admirable version of the self. That is why Hahn speaks of fatigue, depression, and burnout. This is not only physical tiredness. It is an existential exhaustion produced by too much internalized demand. The contemporary individual does not just receive orders. They internalize the command to keep surpassing themselves. If they fail, they blame themselves. If they do not stand out, they feel inadequate. If they cannot maintain an image of exceptionalism, they interpret that as personal failure. The violence of the achievement society is sophisticated precisely because it turns normal human limits into subjective defects. A person is no longer allowed to simply be finite, ordinary, tired, or confused. They have to turn all of that into material for self-improvement. In this setting, discovering that you are not special stops being only a philosophical crisis and becomes almost a social offense. Because the whole environment seems to say that you must find something extraordinary in yourself, monetize it, display it, refine it, and sustain it without interruption. The problem is that no one can live under that command for very long without starting to break apart. The demand for exceptionality is endless. There is always someone more visible, more productive, more admired, more convincing, more unique in the public display window. Comparison becomes constant, and the self enters a state of chronic insufficiency. Hahn helps us see that this suffering is not accidental, but structural. A culture based on performance needs restless individuals, people never fully at peace with themselves, always chasing improvement. It needs subjects who treat themselves as unfinished projects. Inner peace, in this context, is almost subversive. Accepting that you are not special, not needing to prove superiority, not turning life into a display case, all of this goes against the dominant logic. That is why this acceptance is so difficult. It threatens an entire machine built on desire, comparison, and exhaustion. At the same time, Hahn suggests, even if often in a melancholic tone, that resistance is still possible in recovering negativity, contemplation, slowness, the real other, silence, and opacity. A person does not have to be constantly available, transparent, and performative. They do not have to turn every part of life into symbolic capital. There is dignity in refusing constant exposure. There is health in not turning yourself into a company. There is truth in letting go of the compulsion to seem exceptional. Byung-Chul Han updates the philosophical drama of insignificance for the 21st century. The problem is no longer only that the universe does not recognize you as special. The problem is that society demands that you constantly perform an exceptionalism you can barely sustain. Contemporary cruelty lies in this double movement. Ontologically, you are not the center. Culturally, you are expected to act as if you were. And this distance between what we are and what we are required to appear to be creates a deep exhaustion. Maybe true lucidity today is not found in proving uniqueness, but in enduring your ordinary condition without shame, in refusing the blackmail of total performance, in realizing that much of today's suffering comes not from a lack of worth, but from the obligation to display it nonstop. Han shows that the contemporary subject is not only tired of working, they are tired of having to be someone extraordinary all the time. And maybe a more human way of living begins exactly when that obligation starts to fall away. And in the end, maybe the hardest truth, and also the most freeing one, is this: you do not need to be the center of the world in order to live with dignity. You do not need to be extraordinary in the eyes of the universe for your existence to have weight, seriousness, and truth. Maybe maturity is exactly this: letting go of the fantasy of being exceptional and still continuing to live with courage, clarity, and depth. If this video spoke to you on any level, if any of these ideas reached you, unsettled you, or made you think, then it was already worth staying here until the end. And I want to sincerely thank you for staying with me through this reflection. Thank you for your time, your attention, and for allowing this moment of thought in the middle of so much distraction and noise. And now I want to ask you for one thing. If you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next videos. Leave a like, because that really helps the channel reach more people. Share this video with someone who also needs to hear this reflection. And most of all, leave a comment below. Which of these ideas hit you the hardest? Which point did you relate to the most? And stay here on the channel. There are other videos waiting for you, with reflections that can take even deeper everything we talked about here today. See you in the next video.